April 18, 1945, somewhere over the Philippine Sea, about 240 miles east of Okinawa. A lone Japanese Zero fighter cut through the morning clouds like a wounded bird struggling to stay airborne. Smoke poured from its engine cowling, and one wing trembled violently with every gust of wind that hit it. Inside that cramped cockpit sat a young man named Inadvertently Koga, barely 20 years old, tasting blood on his tongue and smelling the salt air mixing with burning oil. His engine coughed once, then twice, each sputter matching the frantic beating of his heart. He had no idea that in less than 4 minutes he would be touching down on the deck of an American aircraft carrier, alive, and that not a single sailor on that ship would fire a shot because what they were about to witness was so impossible that nobody, not even Koga himself, could believe it was really happening. The stage was set for something extraordinary. A Japanese pilot desperately fleeing for his life, a U.S. carrier crew bracing for what they thought was a kamikaze attack, and a landing so unbelievable it would become the stuff of legend. But right now, in this moment, Koga had only one focus: keep his dying Zero in the air long enough to find somewhere, anywhere, to bring it down safely. His mission had started 3 hours earlier from an airfield on Formosa, what was supposed to be a routine patrol over the approaches to Okinawa. But nothing had been routine since America began its relentless island-hopping campaign across the Pacific. Every patrol felt like a gamble with death. This morning, Koga lost that gamble. The American Hellcats struck from above, diving straight out of the sun where they couldn't be seen until it was too late. His wingman disappeared in the first pass, just one flash of fire and a falling plume of black smoke, gone in an instant. Koga jerked his stick hard, felt bullets ripping through his fuselage, heard his engine screaming in protest as he pushed the Zero to its limits. He dove into a thick cloud bank, managed to shake off his pursuers, and then immediately realized something terrible. He had completely lost his bearings. Fuel was draining fast, his engine was failing, his radio was dead, and there was no island anywhere in sight. The Zero shuddered again, more violently this time. Koga glanced down at his instruments and watched the oil pressure needle dropping dangerously low. He scanned the horizon desperately, hoping to spot a strip of land, maybe a beach, anything solid. Instead, he saw something else. Something massive. A shape on the ocean, huge and angular, made of steel, flat and impossibly wide. A ship. No, not just any ship, a monster of a ship. An aircraft carrier. His breath caught in his throat. For just a moment he prayed it might be Japanese, but one closer look killed that hope instantly. The flight deck had white edges. The aircraft parked on it were the wrong shape, bulky and rugged, unmistakably American. A U.S. Navy carrier group was right there below him, and he was flying straight toward it. His stomach twisted into knots. If he turned away now, he would crash into the sea within minutes and drown. If he stayed on course, they would almost certainly shoot him out of the sky. It was no choice at all, just that cruel mathematics of war that every combat pilot eventually had to face. He banked gently, carefully lining himself up with the carrier's flight deck, and prepared for whatever came next. Down on the flight deck of the USS Bogue, air crews were going about their normal business, preparing for recovery operations, when suddenly a lookout shouted from the island superstructure. Incoming aircraft, Zero, low altitude, looks damaged. Alarms blared across the ship. Sailors froze where they stood. Gunners swung their barrels around, fingers on triggers, ready to open fire. But then they noticed something very strange. The Zero wasn't diving toward them. It wasn't accelerating for an attack run. It wasn't even armed with bombs or rockets. Its landing gear were down. It was actually trying to land. A confused murmur rippled through the deck crew as officers sprinted into position, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. Commander Harold Dixon, the air operations chief, stared through his binoculars, completely baffled. What in God's name was happening here? A kamikaze pilot would never lower his landing gear. A fighter trying to strafe them wouldn't be coming in this slow and steady. A reconnaissance plane would never approach a carrier like this. Everything about this situation screamed wrong. "Hold fire," Dixon barked out loud and clear. Hold fire. Koga had no idea that order had just saved his life. He only saw the deck rising up to meet him, getting closer and closer. The carrier's landing signal officer stood frozen on the deck, paddles in his hands, completely uncertain about what he was supposed to do. Was he really supposed to guide an enemy Zero onto the deck, like it was just another American plane coming home? The Japanese fighter descended through turbulent gusts of wind rising off the carrier's bow. Koga gripped the stick with everything he had, eyes locked on the deck ahead. 50 feet, 30 feet, 20. The Zero wobbled dangerously. More smoke spat from the damaged cowling. The arresting wires gleamed below him in the sunlight. Koga exhaled slowly, easing back on the throttle, and then the engine just died. Quit completely. The nose dropped suddenly. The deck rushed upward toward him. Sailors on deck flinched instinctively. The landing signal officer dove out of the way. Someone shouted, "Brace for impact." The Zero slammed down onto the wooden deck with a heavy metallic crack, bounced once hard, then skidded sideways with its wheels screaming across the planks. The tail hook scraping across 3 arresting wires before finally catching the 4th one and jerking the entire aircraft violently to a complete stop. For one heartbeat, there was absolute silence. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Inen Tadayoshi Koga sat in the cockpit trembling from head to toe, completely stunned that he was still alive, that he hadn't exploded or crashed or been shot down. The American sailors on deck stared back at him with their jaws hanging open, trying desperately to make sense of the impossible thing they had just witnessed. A Japanese pilot had just actually landed, on an American aircraft carrier in the middle of a war zone. Slowly, carefully, Koga raised both hands above his head in surrender. The nearest sailors lifted their rifles, pointing them at the cockpit, but nobody fired. No shots, no shouting, just this surreal, breathless, frozen moment where 2 groups of enemies blinked at each other in complete disbelief. Commander Dixon stepped forward and spoke the words that would later be retold in a dozen different war memoirs. "Secure the pilot. He's ours now." Koga swallowed hard, his throat dry as sand. He had absolutely no idea what was waiting for him, but his war, at least his war in the air, was finally over. The deck crew approached slowly and cautiously with their weapons raised, but their fingers carefully off the triggers. Nobody wanted to be the person who made the wrong move and ruined this unprecedented moment. After all, no American had ever captured a Japanese pilot like this before. Not from the sky, not from an aircraft that was still warm from combat flight, and certainly not from the deck of a carrier he had nearly crashed into. The cockpit canopy creaked as Koga pushed it open with shaking hands. His hands were still raised high, trembling from pure adrenaline and total exhaustion. He was a small man, barely 5'4", with engine oil streaked across his cheek and a cut bleeding above his eyebrow. The wind whipped across the open deck, drying the sweat that covered his face. A young American sailor, probably no older than Koga himself, stared at the Japanese pilot with wide, almost confused eyes and muttered under his breath, "Jesus, he's just a kid." Koga understood that word, kid, because he had learned fragments of English back in school, but he kept his gaze straight ahead, trying to maintain whatever dignity he had left. He had been trained his entire military life never to surrender, to resist until his last breath, to take his own life rather than fall into enemy hands and bring shame to his family and his country. But he also understood a simpler truth. If he tried anything stupid right now, he would be dead within seconds, shot down on this foreign deck far from home. Commander Dixon walked up slowly, his boots thumping heavily against the wooden planking. He studied the young enemy pilot for several long seconds, reading his face, his posture, his fear, and then spoke in a calm but absolutely firm tone. "You're going to be treated fairly. Don't make any sudden moves. Do you understand?" Koga hesitated for just a moment, processing the English words, and then nodded once. Two sailors moved in carefully, gently pulling him out of the cramped cockpit. His legs buckled completely the moment his boots touched the deck. He hadn't realized just how weak and dehydrated he had become during those hours of flying and fighting, and the sailors caught him instinctively, holding him upright. That brief moment, as simple as it was, somehow humanized everything that was happening. An enemy pilot who had been feared in the air just minutes ago was now revealed as nothing more than a wounded, exhausted, terrified young man standing among the very people he had been trained his whole life to kill. The crew led him across the flight deck toward the island superstructure, and Koga's eyes darted around constantly, taking everything in despite his situation. He studied the Grumman Wildcats and Avenger torpedo bombers parked in neat, organized rows. He watched crewmen in white safety vests dragging fuel hoses, rolling wheel chocks into position, guiding aircraft with practiced, efficient movements. He couldn't help himself from being amazed. This wasn't anything like the chaotic, undersupplied, fuel-starved Japanese airfields he had known. This was like a floating city, efficient and clean and organized with lethal precision. No wonder America seemed to never run out of planes or pilots or supplies. As Koga was escorted below deck through narrow metal corridors, the flight crews gathered eagerly around the captured Zero like children around a new toy. Some reached out and touched the skin of the aircraft, genuinely surprised at how thin the metal was, more like a soda can than proper armor plating. Others peered curiously into the open cockpit, pointing things out to each other. "Look at this," one said. "No armor plating anywhere. Nothing. And the fuel lines, they're completely exposed, right there in the open. Everything's built so damn light. No wonder these things turn on a dime." One mechanic let out a low whistle and shook his head. "This thing's basically a death trap with wings attached." But to the U.S. Navy, intelligence officers who were already gathering, the Zero was anything but a death trap. It was an absolute treasure. A fully intact, combat-flown A6M0, the very aircraft that American pilots had feared and respected since Pearl Harbor, the fighter that had dominated Pacific skies in the early years of the war. And now it sat quietly on their deck, captured without a single bullet being fired at it, ready to give up all its secrets. The intelligence officers descended on the aircraft almost immediately, cameras flashing, notepads filling with observations. Below deck, Koga was taken to a small, bare metal compartment with two military police guards posted outside the door. He sat down heavily on a cold metal bench, hands clasped tightly together in his lap, and fully expected to be beaten or interrogated brutally. Everything Japan had drilled into its pilots said that Americans were cruel barbarians who tortured their prisoners without mercy. But instead, a medic entered the room carrying a small medical kit. "Hold still," the medic said gently, dabbing at the cut above Koga's eyebrow with antiseptic solution. Koga flinched at the sharp sting, but the medic didn't raise his voice or strike him or show any anger. He simply continued working with calm, professional care. When he finished cleaning and bandaging the wound, he handed Koga a small metal cup filled with water. Koga stared at it suspiciously, wondering if it might be poisoned or drugged. The medic noticed his hesitation and simply nodded encouragingly. "Go ahead, it's fine." Koga drank carefully. The water was cold and clean, and tasted better than anything he had drunk in months on those desperate island bases. The medic gave him a small, reassuring smile. "You'll be all right, kid." And then he quietly left the room. Koga sat there and exhaled shakily, his entire worldview suddenly uncertain. His entire life, every military speech, every propaganda pamphlet, every commanding officer had told him over and over that Americans were brutal monsters who showed no mercy. Yet the very first American who had actually interacted with him one-on-one had treated him like a fellow human being, with basic dignity and simple kindness. That contradiction shook him more deeply than the crash landing itself had. Word of the Zero's capture spread through the entire carrier group like wildfire. Within minutes, a dozen officers were crowded around the aircraft on deck, all talking excitedly. Camera crews appeared from below, clicking photos from every possible angle for intelligence analysis. The chief engineer, a man named Addison, practically climbed underneath the fuselage to inspect the engine mounts and structural supports up close. "Look at these weight savings," he muttered in amazement. "Everything is absolutely minimal. They sacrificed all protection and durability for pure maneuverability and climb rate." Commander Dixon stood beside him, arms crossed, staring at the captured fighter. "Can we actually put her back in the air and test fly her?" Addison looked up and grinned widely. "Oh, we're damn sure going to try, sir." Meanwhile, Captain Giles, the ship's overall commanding officer, exchanged significant glances with his senior air intelligence officer. "This goes straight to Washington immediately," Giles said firmly. "We need secure transport arranged the moment we return to port. No delays." A captured Zero in flyable condition meant detailed performance testing, combat simulations, tactical analysis, and a massive potential shift in American air combat strategy and pilot training. It was exactly the kind of intelligence discovery that could save hundreds, maybe even thousands of American lives in future battles. All because one young Japanese pilot had miscalculated his navigation, trusted the wrong patch of empty ocean, and chosen survival over death. In his small compartment below deck, Koga could feel the constant vibrations traveling through the metal walls as aircraft continued launching and landing on the flight deck above. He imagined his Zero being carefully examined, poked and prodded and studied by enemy engineers and intelligence analysts. He wondered painfully what his commanding officers back on Formosa would think of him now, whether his family back home would ever know he had survived this day, or whether Japan would simply declare him officially dead and erase his name in disgrace. He bowed his head low and closed his eyes. He had completely failed his mission, failed his squadron, failed his homeland, and now his aircraft, the pride of Japanese aviation engineering, was in enemy hands being torn apart for secrets. The weight of that shame pressed down on him like a physical force, suffocating and inescapable. But despite everything, despite all the shame and failure and dishonor, he was still breathing. He was still alive. And somehow, in the strange, twisted logic of war, that simple fact of survival was its own kind of defiance against fate. Up on the flight deck, as the sun began to set and paint the ocean in shades of orange and red, Commander Dixon stood quietly beside the captured Zero and slowly shook his head in genuine disbelief at what had happened.